Hello everyone. This will be our last section of notes for the Chapter 11 blood unit. We are going to talk about blood types and we're going to talk about disorders of the blood. So on the screen right now you can see there is a pretty picture there. This is going to be the molecular structure of what we would call an antibody. So you've probably heard of antibodies. Antibodies are what our immune system produces in order to try to fight anything that's going to make us sick or anything that the body's unfamiliar with. So we have to be careful that our body doesn't produce antibodies based on the antigens that are on blood, and that's what gives us blood type is antigens. So here we have some antigens. You'll notice here around the outside of this blood cell here where it says blood cell A or group A, you'll notice that these are like pink little circles around the outside. Those would be considered the antigens. So down here at the bottom, you'll notice the antigens in red blood cells, antigen A, we have little pink circles that will go around the outside and that will mark type A blood. Then we have some that have antigen B. Antigen B, you'll notice, are like little blue squares. And if I come up to the top here, you can see that I have B-type blood. Now, the interesting thing is, before we move on to our next blood group, I want you to notice the antibodies. So the last screen I showed you the antibodies. If you have blood type A, you're going to have what we call anti-B antibodies. And if you're blood type B, you're going to have anti-A antibodies. So you'll notice those are opposite. If you're blood type A, you have antibody Bs. If you're blood type B, you have anti-A antibodies. So when we get to AB, notice the antigens. The antigens are, again, what's around the outside. Here we have A and B. Down here it says antigens A and B. Okay, those mark the outside of the cell. And if this is the case, then it's not going to have either antibodies. No anti-A or anti-B antibodies. Then we get to our last group, our O's. Blood type O. You'll notice the antigens around the outside are none. There are no antigens on the outside of an O blood cell. Now in the blood, you're going to find both anti-A and anti-B antibodies in somebody that has type O blood. So what I'd like you to do is I would like you to copy down a chart that looks like this. I want you to remember that the antigens are what mark the outside of the body. That is a type of protein that is going to be on the outside of the blood cells, the erythrocytes, the red blood cells. And then I want you to fill in what type of antigen is on type A blood, type B, type AB, and type O. And then I want you to write down what antibodies are there. Okay, and the antibodies are going to be what we call a bonding agent. And those bonding agents are going to do what we call agglutination. So if you guys want to stop the video here and fill out your blood types, that's perfect. Okay. And this next slide here is the slide where you can check and make sure that you wrote down your blood type antigens and antibodies correct. Okay, so the last thing you guys need to understand is whether or not somebody is considered positive or negative. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. This is what we call the Rh factor. Before they figured out the Rh factor, they realized that people could receive a blood transfusion and still have problems with agglutination. Agglutination is when the blood clots because the antibodies are going to attack the antigens, and that causes a clumping, which marks them for elimination, but you don't want the elimination. You don't want those antibodies coagulating the blood, clotting the blood, because then it's not working as blood. It's not carrying those red blood cells. So there was a gentleman that studied the blood factor in rhesus monkeys. That's where we get the Rh factor, rhesus monkeys. So if you're positive, that means that you have an extra antigen, we call it antigen D, on your blood cells. So if you're A positive, I want you to think back up to the top here where we talked about group A has these little antigens here. We'll now add on top of that a positive. Group B could have B positive, and then it would have antigen D. You can be AB positive, so you would add to this antigen the positive antigen of the Rh factor, which would make you AB positive. Now here it says antigens in the blood, none. That is going to stay the same because if you're O positive, you are still going to have a lack of antibodies. But anyway, the Rh factor, you're either positive or negative for antigen D. And here's where it says here that you do not have anti-D antibodies. So most people are Rh positive. I did in fact test my blood and I am O positive, so I am like most people. So there are 8 different types of blood. A positive, A negative, B positive, B negative, AB positive, AB negative, O positive, and O negative. Now usually the positive and negative factor doesn't make much difference unless you're pregnant. Now, if the father's positive and the mother's negative, that means that the baby can be positive, and the mother's negative body means that it might attack those positive blood cells there. Okay, so we have invading Rh positive blood cells causing the production of Rh antibodies, which is unusual. Okay, so if there's later pregnancies, that means that those antibodies could attack the next baby. And if those antibodies attack the next baby, it is going to cause the baby can die. So it's very, very important that when mothers become pregnant, that they test the babies. And when they test the babies, they can find out if the baby is going to be positive or negative. If the baby is Rh positive, that means that we need to make sure that after that baby is born, that woman gets an anti-D antibody shot. Okay, so sometimes it's bad enough that the baby has to be given a transfusion through the umbilical cord. Can't imagine giving a baby that's still inside somebody else a blood transfusion, but they do it. Okay, but this anti-D antibody shot after the birth of all Rh positive babies will eliminate those antibodies in the mother's body, so the mother's body will never try to eliminate another pregnancy. All right, so those are our blood types. Remember that there's 8, A, B, AB, and O. And they can all be positive or negative for a total of 8 types of blood. All right, the last thing that we need to learn about is the idea of blood disorders. In blood disorders, there's going to be a few things that we're going to talk about, okay? One of which is anemia. Anemia, of course, is caused by a lack of iron. It can also be a lack of vitamin B12. You can have anemia because you have been bleeding a lot, or if you have sickle cell anemia. So when we look at iron deficiency anemia, we can see that the amount of red blood cells here in the space is reduced greatly from what's normal. So if you guys remember looking at normal blood, it looks like what you see on the right, but then that anemic blood is there on the left. So anemia, again, causes a lack of red blood cells. Hopefully you guys remember that red blood cells carry oxygen. So that person is not going to have enough oxygen, which of course causes cellular damage and so forth. The other thing that you need to understand is hemophilia. Hemophilia is something that's inherited. It's more often in males than in females. It is a sex-linked trait. And one or more of those clotting factors is absent. I think I mentioned this a little bit. So treatments, they can give you blood products. So believe it or not, when you give blood, you can give just blood products. So hemophiliacs can get blood products from the hospital if they're having an episode of bleeding to help them stop. But again, their body's going to process those out. So they would have to get treatment each time they had some sort of issue. They wouldn't be cured of their illness. Hemophilia was first discovered in the royal family because the royal family was who we kept track of. So I don't know if you remember how to read a pedigree. Really quickly, I'll go through this here. Remember, you have a man and a woman, and here we have a daughter. The daughter is a carrier. She has half of that circle shaded in. Well, she got married. And remember when all of the girls get the X chromosome from mom, they can get the X chromosome from dad, and they're still girls. Well, this girl here got the gene, and this boy here got the disease. This girl here got the gene. Now, this boy here got the disease because he didn't get an X from his dad. He got a Y from his dad. So he didn't have a dominant gene to cover up the recessive one his mom gave him. So when he had daughters, he gave it to his daughter, and she became a carrier. But she was only a carrier because she got the good gene from her mom. So the good gene covered up the bad gene, but she was still a carrier. So now when she had a little boy, she gave the X, dad gave the Y, and her son became a hemophiliac. So this is how we realize that hemophilia is a sex-linked trait. There's about 20,000 people in the United States that are born with hemophilia. And each year, about 400 babies are born with hemophilia. So treatments for hemophilia, again, they give them clotting factors, okay? And here's the demand therapy I was saying, that if you get injured, you need to go to the hospital and get blood products so that way you can stop bleeding. But there's also replacement therapies where you can get blood products on a regular basis. You can get those clotting factors in order to make it so that way if you do get cut or you start bleeding, that you are okay. All right, the other thing just to mention, we talked about sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia, remember these cells come out sickle shaped. They get stuck in the capillaries. They don't carry as much oxygen. Evidently, sickle cell anemia is very painful because the blood cells get clogged, and you get many blood clots all over. Sickle cell trait occurs in about 1 in 12 African Americans. 1 in 12, that's a lot. But it only affects 1 out of every 500 African American births. So the sickle cell trait means that they have some sickle cells, but you have to have a certain number of cells being produced to make it that you have the disease. Okay, so in Hispanics, only 1 out of every 36,000 Hispanics have sickle cell disease. So we're lucky that it doesn't run in our gene pool. Okay, last but not least is leukemia. I want you to remember that leukemia is a type of cancer. Cancer is uncontrollable growth. You'll notice here that there's a lot more lymphocytes than we saw in the normal blood cell or in the normal blood sample. And the thing that's really important to understand is that it takes up a huge amount of the blood volume. So the red blood cells can't do their job of carrying around the oxygen, and then these are rapidly produced lymphocytes. Because they're rapidly produced, there's lots of errors in them, and well, that person's going to feel weak. They're going to have a compromised immune system because those lymphocytes aren't able to fight the viral infections that they normally do. They aren't able to fight the tumors that they normally fight. So somebody with leukemia is, it's like a double whammy because 1, their blood volume is taken up by cells that don't really function correctly, and then 2, their immune system doesn't function correctly because those lymphocytes can't do their job. So some statistics on leukemia. Children 1 to 4 get it. The highest death rates are in children 10 to 19. Lots of times kids will get it and they will be treated and they get better. You'll notice that some of these percentages are better than others, so feel free to stop and read this. I'm sorry my video cut this off. If you look through the website to the blood notes that are directly on the Google Drive, you will be able to see these other numbers that got cut off. But at the present time, there are approximately 218,659 people living with leukemia in the United States. So this is something that we want to figure out and work on, because remember that they all come from these stem cells. So the stem cells here, notice that the leukocytes, there's 5 different leukocytes we know, but the lymphocytes come from one branch of those stem cells. So that right there is where we get the leukemia from. It's very, very sad. Cancer in children is probably one of the saddest things. Okay, so this ends our notes. When you finish up with leukemia there, you're going to want to write your final summary. You are going to have 3 summaries for this section. So you'll have one after red blood cells, one after white blood cells, and now you're going to have one after disorders, which includes blood type and blood plasma. So this last summary is bigger than the others. All right, make sure to do your vocabulary words in the left-hand column. Make sure to review each evening. Your test coming up will be 50 questions, so make sure to review. Have a great day.